After you finish listening to the story, don't forget to leave a comment about what you would have done in the character's place. Now, let's dive into the story. Kathy and Chris lived in a modern, bustling city, a place where glass skyscrapers reflected the sun and the streets were always alive with the hum of activity. Their life, from the outside, was the picture of stability. Chris, a mid-level architect at a prestigious firm, was the kind of man who prided himself on his attention to detail and his ability to create order out of chaos. Kathy, a freelance photographer, was the creative force behind their household, her talent evident in the framed photos that adorned their apartment walls. They were the couple everyone admired, attractive, accomplished, and seemingly in love. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were beginning to show. Kathy had always been the more spontaneous of the two, her free spirit often clashing with Chris's methodical, by-the-book approach to life. Lately, she had been feeling restless, as if the life they had built together was a cage rather than a sanctuary. Chris, oblivious to her growing discontent, continued to pour himself into his work. Believing that his long hours and dedication would eventually pay off in the form of a promotion and a more comfortable life for them both. The first sign that something was amiss came on a Thursday evening. Chris had come home late, as usual, to find Kathy sitting on the couch, her laptop open but her attention clearly elsewhere. She had been distant for weeks, but tonight, her detachment felt more pronounced. When he asked her how her day had been, she responded with a vague, "Fine," before excusing herself to take a shower. Chris didn't think much of it at the time. He was used to her occasional mood swings, attributing them to the stress of her freelance projects. But as the days turned into weeks, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She started staying out late, claiming she was meeting with clients or working on tight deadlines. Her phone, which had once been left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always within arm's reach, and she had taken to silencing it whenever Chris was in the room. One evening, Chris came home early, hoping to surprise Kathy with dinner. He had even stopped by her favorite Italian restaurant to pick up her favorite pasta dish. But when he walked through the door, the apartment was empty. He called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Puzzled, he sent her a text, "Hey, where are you? I'm home early. Let's have dinner together." An hour passed with no response. Then two. By the time Kathy finally walked through the door, Chris was sitting at the kitchen table, the uneaten pasta in front of him, his worry turning to frustration. "Where have you been?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Kathy froze for a moment, her eyes darting to the pasta and then back to Chris. "I was at a client meeting," she said quickly, too quickly. "It ran late and my phone died. I'm sorry." Chris wanted to believe her, but something in her tone didn't sit right with him. He had known Kathy long enough to recognize when she was hiding something. Still, he decided not to push it, not yet. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "Well, I got your favorite pasta. Let's eat." But as they sat there, picking at the food in silence, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few weeks were a blur of tension and suspicion. Chris began to notice little things he might have overlooked before. The way Kathy would quickly close her laptop when he entered the room. The way she would sometimes disappear into the bathroom for long periods only to emerge with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The way she had started dressing differently, her outfits more daring, her makeup more elaborate. One night, after Kathy had fallen asleep, Chris found himself staring at her phone, which she had left charging on the nightstand. He knew he shouldn't, but the gnawing suspicion in his gut was too strong to ignore. Carefully, he picked up the phone and unlocked it using the passcode he had seen her enter countless times. What he found made his blood run cold. There were messages, dozens of them, from a man named Daniel. The tone was flirtatious, playful, and at times, downright intimate. Chris's hands trembled as he scrolled through the conversations, each one a dagger to his heart. Kathy had been lying to him, not just about her whereabouts, but about everything. He felt a surge of anger, but also something else, something deeper and more painful. Betrayal. He had trusted her, loved her, and this was how she repaid him. The next morning, Chris confronted her. He didn't yell, didn't scream. Instead, he spoke in a low, measured tone, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Who is Daniel?" he asked, holding up her phone. Kathy's face went pale. For a moment, she looked as though she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "Chris, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "What is this, Kathy?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are you having an affair?" She hesitated, then nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. It just happened. I didn't plan it. I was feeling so lost, so alone, and Daniel. He made me feel alive again." Chris felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, on providing for Kathy and making her happy. But now, he realized it hadn't been enough. She had been searching for something he couldn't give her, and in her desperation, she had turned to someone else. "Who is he?" Chris asked, his voice cold. "Who is Daniel?" Kathy hesitated again, then said, He's a client. We met through work. He's a billionaire, Chris. He owns a tech startup. He's everything you're not." The words cut deeper than any knife. Chris felt a surge of anger, but also something else, something darker. A desire for revenge. But before he could say anything, Kathy spoke again, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Chris. I never wanted to hurt you. But I can't keep living like this. I need more." Chris stared at her, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a rational man, someone who could handle any situation with logic and reason. But now, faced with the ultimate betrayal, he wasn't sure what he was capable of. "Get out," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get out of my house." Kathy looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door. Chris stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. He felt numb, as though the world had lost all its color. But beneath the numbness, there was something else, something dangerous. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed Kathy's confession were a blur for Chris. He moved through life like a ghost, going to work, attending meetings, and even managing to smile and make small talk with his colleagues. But inside, he was hollow. The betrayal had carved out a part of him, leaving behind a void that nothing could fill. He tried to distract himself with work, throwing himself into projects and staying late at the office. But no matter how busy he kept himself, the image of Kathy and Daniel haunted him. He couldn't stop wondering about the man who had stolen his wife's affection. Who was he? What did he have that Chris didn't? And most importantly, how had Kathy allowed herself to fall for him? One evening, after another long day at the office, Chris found himself sitting in his car outside a high-rise building in the heart of the city. He had done some digging and discovered that this was where Daniel's company was headquartered. He didn't know what he was planning to do, confront the man, maybe, but he felt drawn to the place, as if seeing Daniel in person would somehow make sense of everything. As he sat there, staring up at the gleaming tower, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Kathy. "Can we talk?" It read. Chris stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He hadn't spoken to her since she had walked out the door, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face her. But curiosity got the better of him, and he replied, "Where?" She suggested a small cafe near their old apartment, a place they used to go to on lazy Sunday mornings. Chris agreed, though he wasn't sure what to expect. When he arrived, Kathy was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked different, softer, more vulnerable. The bold, confident woman he had married seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who looked lost and unsure. "Thanks for coming," she said as he sat down. Chris nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He ordered a coffee and waited for her to continue. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "About us. About what happened. And I realize now how much I've hurt you. I'm so sorry, Chris. I never wanted to hurt you. Chris felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Why did you do it, Kathy? Why him? She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. I don't know. I was feeling so lost, so disconnected from everything. And Daniel. He made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered. Chris's jaw tightened. And I didn't. It's not that simple, Kathy said, her voice breaking. You're a good man, Chris. You've always been good to me. But I needed more than just stability. I needed passion. I needed to feel alive. Chris stared at her, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a good husband, someone who provided for his wife and made her feel secure. But now, he realized, that hadn't been enough. Kathy had needed something he couldn't give her, and in her desperation, she had turned to someone else. What happens now? He asked finally. Kathy looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know. I needed to see you. To apologize. To try to explain. Chris nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. He finished his coffee in silence, then stood up to leave. Chris, Kathy said, her voice barely above a whisper. I still care about you. I always will. Chris didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the cafe, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Over the next few weeks, Chris threw himself into his work with a renewed intensity. He started taking on more projects, working longer hours, and even volunteering for assignments that no one else wanted. He told himself it was to distract himself from the pain, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was trying to prove something, to himself, to Kathy, to the world. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. The betrayal had left a scar that wouldn't heal, and he found himself growing more and more bitter. He started to resent Kathy, not just for what she had done, but for the way she had made him feel, like he wasn't enough. One evening, after another long day at the office, Chris found himself standing outside Daniel's building again. This time, he didn't just sit in his car. He walked inside, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. The receptionist looked up as he approached the desk. Can I help you? She asked. I need to see Daniel, Chris said, his voice steady. The receptionist frowned. Do you have an appointment? No, Chris said. But he'll want to see me. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. A few moments later, she nodded and gestured for Chris to follow her. Daniel's office was on the top floor, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Daniel himself was sitting behind a sleek, modern desk, his expression one of mild curiosity as Chris walked in. Chris, right? Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. Kathy's husband. Chris felt a surge of anger at the casual way Daniel said his name, as if they were old friends. Ex-husband, he corrected. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Ah. I see. Well, what can I do for you? Chris took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. I want to know why. Why her? Why us? Daniel sighed, as if he had been expecting this question. Look, Chris, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm the bad guy. Kathy came to me. She was unhappy, and I gave her what she needed. It's as simple as that. Chris felt his fists clench at his sides. You destroyed my marriage. Daniel shrugged. Your marriage was already broken. I just helped her see that. Chris took a step forward, his anger boiling over. You think you're so clever, don't you? With your money and your power. But you're just a coward. You prey on people's weaknesses because you're too afraid to face your own. Daniel's expression darkened. Careful, Chris. You're treading on thin ice. But Chris was beyond caring. He had spent weeks bottling up his anger, and now it was all coming out. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. One day, someone's going to see you for what you really are. And when that happens, you're going to wish you had never crossed me. Daniel stood up, his eyes narrowing. Is that a threat? Chris didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. As he drove home, Chris felt a strange sense of clarity. He had spent weeks feeling lost and powerless, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was back in control. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Daniel, or anyone else, define him. When he got home, he found a package waiting for him on the doorstep. It was a small, unmarked box with no return address. Curious, he opened it and found a single item inside, a USB drive. Chris frowned, his mind racing. He plugged the drive into his laptop and opened the files. What he found made his blood run cold. It was evidence, photos, emails, documents, all implicating Daniel in a series of illegal activities. Fraud, embezzlement, even bribery. The scale of it was staggering, and Chris realized that he was holding the key to Daniel's downfall. For a moment, he hesitated. He could destroy the drive, walk away, and let Daniel continue his life of privilege and power. Or he could use it, expose Daniel for the criminal he was, and take back some measure of control. In the end, the choice was easy. Chris sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop screen casting long shadows across the room. The files on the USB drive were damning, a meticulously compiled dossier of Daniel's misdeeds. There were emails detailing bribes to government officials, spreadsheets tracking embezzled funds, and even photos of Daniel meeting with known criminals. It was a treasure trove of evidence, and Chris knew it could destroy Daniel's empire and his life. But as he scrolled through the files, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Who had sent him this? And why? It didn't make sense. Daniel was a billionaire, a man with connections and resources. Whoever had gathered this evidence had taken a huge risk, and yet they had handed it over to Chris, a man with no power or influence. Chris's first instinct was to go to the police, but he quickly dismissed the idea. Daniel was too well connected. He would find a way to bury the evidence, or worse, turn it back on Chris. No, if Chris was going to use this, he needed to be smart about it. He spent the next few days researching Daniel's company, trying to understand the full scope of his operations. He reached out to old contacts, called in favors, and even hired a private investigator to dig deeper. What he discovered was both shocking and infuriating. Daniel's empire was built on a foundation of lies and corruption, and yet he had managed to present himself as a self-made success story, a visionary entrepreneur who had risen from nothing. Chris knew he couldn't take Daniel down alone. He needed allies, people who had been hurt by Daniel's actions and were willing to fight back. He started reaching out to former employees, investors, and even competitors, slowly building a network of people who were just as eager to see Daniel fall as he was. One of the first people he contacted was a former employee named Sarah, who had been fired after she refused to falsify financial records. She was hesitant at first, but when Chris showed her the evidence, she agreed to help. Daniel ruined my life, she said, her voice trembling with anger. If there's a chance to make him pay, I'm in. With Sarah's help, Chris began to piece together a plan. They would leak the evidence to the media, but not all at once. They would release it in stages, keeping the story alive and forcing Daniel to constantly defend himself. They would also reach out to regulators and law enforcement, providing them with enough information to launch their own investigations. It was a risky plan, but Chris was willing to take the chance. He had nothing left to lose. The first leak came 2 weeks later. A prominent financial news outlet published an expose detailing Daniel's involvement in a bribery scheme. The story was explosive, and within hours, it was picked up by major news networks. Daniel's company's stock plummeted, and investors began pulling out in droves. Daniel responded with a carefully worded statement, denying the allegations and accusing the media of sensationalism. But the damage had been done. The story had planted a seed of doubt, and it was only a matter of time before it grew. Chris watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He had set the wheels in motion, but he knew the fight was far from over. Daniel was a powerful man, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The next leak came a week later. This time, it was a series of emails between Daniel and a known crime boss discussing the laundering of millions of dollars. The story was even more damaging than the first, and this time, Daniel's denials fell on deaf ears. Regulators launched an investigation, and Daniel was forced to step down as CEO of his company. Chris felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched Daniel's empire crumble. But his victory was short-lived. A few days later, he received a call from Sarah. "Chris, we have a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Daniel knows it was us. He's coming after you." Chris's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "He's hired a team of lawyers and private investigators," Sarah explained. "They are digging into your past, looking for anything they can use against you. You need to be careful." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this was a possibility, but he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He had spent weeks focusing on taking Daniel down, but now he realized he had left himself vulnerable. "What should I do?" he asked. "Lay low," Sarah advised. "Don't do anything that could give them ammunition. And for God's sake, don't talk to anyone about this." Chris nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. He had already come too far to back down now. Over the next few weeks, Chris found himself living in a state of constant paranoia. He started noticing strange cars parked outside his apartment, and he was sure he was being followed. He stopped answering his phone, afraid that Daniel's people might be listening. He even began to question whether he could trust Sarah or if she had been compromised. But despite the fear, Chris refused to give up. He continued to leak information to the media, each story more damaging than the last. Daniel's reputation was in tatters and his company was on the brink of collapse. But Chris knew the fight wasn't over. Daniel was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. One evening, as Chris was walking home from work, he was approached by a man in a dark suit. The man didn't say a word, just handed Chris an envelope and walked away. Chris's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in bold, block letters. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." Chris felt a surge of anger, but also fear. Daniel was trying to intimidate him, but Chris wasn't going to back down. He crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, his resolve stronger than ever. The final blow came a week later. Chris had been working with a team of journalists to compile a comprehensive report on Daniel's crimes. The story was set to be published in a major newspaper, and Chris knew it would be the nail in Daniel's coffin. But as he was preparing to send the final files, he received a call from Kathy. "Chris, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about Daniel." Chris's heart skipped a beat. "What about him?" He's threatening me," Kathy said, her voice breaking. "He says if you don't stop, he'll ruin me. He'll release photos, videos. Things that could destroy my life." Chris felt a surge of anger. Daniel was trying to use Kathy to get to him, and it was working. He couldn't let her suffer because of his actions. "I'll handle it," Chris said, his voice steady. "Just stay out of sight. Don't talk to anyone." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, the story was published. It was a bombshell, detailing Daniel's crimes in excruciating detail. The fallout was immediate. Daniel was arrested, his assets were frozen, and his company was dissolved. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. Chris knew Daniel's people would come after him, but he was ready. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence and building a case against Daniel's enablers. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone Daniel had hurt. As he watched the news coverage of Daniel's arrest, Chris felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost so much, his marriage, his sense of security, even a part of himself. But he had also found something he hadn't known he was capable of, strength. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Chris felt like he was in control. The weeks following Daniel's arrest were a whirlwind of media attention, legal battles, and personal reckoning. Chris found himself at the center of a storm he had helped create, his name splashed across headlines as the man who had taken down a billionaire. But the victory felt hollow. The cost had been too high. Kathy, shaken by Daniel's threats, had fled the city. She called Chris once, her voice trembling, to thank him for protecting her. But their conversation was brief and awkward, a painful reminder of what they had lost. Chris knew their marriage was over, and though it hurt, he also felt a strange sense of relief. The lies, the betrayal, the constant tension, it was all behind him now. Daniel's trial was a spectacle, drawing national attention. The evidence Chris had helped uncover was damning, and Daniel's defense team struggled to counter it. Witness after witness took the stand, detailing the extent of Daniel's crimes. Former employees, investors, and even government officials testified against him, painting a picture of a man who had built his empire on greed and corruption. Chris watched the trial from the sidelines, his emotions a tangled mix of satisfaction and regret. He had wanted justice, but he hadn't anticipated the toll it would take on him. The constant scrutiny, the threats from Daniel's remaining allies, the sleepless nights, it was exhausting. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. He had started this fight, and he was determined to see it through to the end. When the verdict finally came, it was a moment of vindication. Daniel was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, his empire reduced to rubble. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Chris sat quietly, his mind racing. He had won, but at what cost? In the months that followed, Chris tried to rebuild his life. He left his job at the architecture firm, unable to stomach the corporate world after everything he had been through. Instead, he started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping victims of corporate fraud and corruption. It was a way to channel his anger and pain into something positive, to give meaning to the chaos he had endured. He also reconnected with Sarah, the former employee who had helped him take down Daniel. They became close, bonding over their shared experiences and their determination to make a difference. Sarah joined Chris's nonprofit, and together they worked to expose other corrupt executives and hold them accountable. But despite the progress he was making, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had spent so much of his life focused on work, on proving himself, that he had neglected the things that truly mattered. He had lost Kathy, his sense of self, and even his faith in humanity. And though he had found a new purpose, he couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. One evening, as he was walking home from work, Chris found himself standing outside the cafe where he had last spoken to Kathy. He hadn't been back since that day, but something drew him inside. The place was quiet, the air thick with the scent of coffee and pastries. He ordered a cup of coffee and sat down at the same corner table, his mind wandering. As he sat there, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Chris." He looked up to see Kathy standing in front of him, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked different, softer, more grounded. The bold, restless woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone who seemed more at peace. "Kathy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated, then sat down across from him. "I could ask you the same thing." Chris shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I just needed to. Remember?" Kathy nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. "I've been doing a lot of remembering too. About us. About everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Kathy spoke again. "I'm sorry, Chris. For everything. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Chris looked at her, his heart aching. "I'm sorry too. For not being the husband you needed. For not seeing how lost you were." Kathy reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on top of his. "We were both lost, Chris. But maybe we can find our way back." Chris felt a surge of emotion, but he didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wasn't easy. Chris and Kathy had both changed, and rebuilding their relationship would take time and effort. But they were willing to try. They started meeting regularly, talking about their past, their mistakes, and their hopes for the future. It was painful at times, but it was also healing. As they worked to rebuild their lives, Chris found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He had started his journey seeking revenge, but he had ended it finding something far more valuable: redemption. He had faced his darkest fears and come out stronger on the other side. And though the scars would always remain, they were a reminder of how far he had come. In the end, Chris realized that life wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding meaning in the chaos, about learning to forgive both others and yourself. And as he sat across from Kathy, their hands intertwined, he knew that he had finally found his way home.